the AudioNowcast, sponsored by API and Wire World Pro Audio. Now from the Nowcast Network Studios, here's Mike.
Hey, welcome to the AudioNowcast. My name is Mike Rodriguez, and before we get going, let me introduce the guys. Starting with Mr. Brandon Birdseye. Brandon.
Hey, Mike. Hey, guys. Good to see everyone.
Next, we have Mr. Nick Peck.
Oh.
Is that what we waited for?
Yes, that's what you waited for. You waited for that because I couldn't find my Santa hat that I bought today that I was going to be wearing to surprise everyone and get on.
You know what? We'll do one more before Christmas, so you still get a chance.
Well, forget it. All right, let's try again. Hello, Mike. Hello, gentlemen. Happy holidays.
Hey, Nick. And finally, we have the Iron Man of the AudioNowcast, Mr. I've Never Missed a Show. This is show number 218, Rob Arbitier. Rob.
Hey there, Mike. Hey, everybody.
Rob, it's good to see you, brother.
It's good to be back.
And today we have an amazing guest. I mean, amazing. This is probably the nicest guy in Hollywood. And I had the pleasure of working with him for about 12 years. And he wrote a fantastic book that we're going to be talking about. This is Mr. Stephen Smith. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. Not good to be with you all. Thanks.
It's so great. Seriously, Stephen is such a nice guy that his emails, even if he had notes, just were the nicest thing in the world. Especially if he hated something you did, he would just be so nice, and you'd have to redo something. but at least he was nice.
I loved going into the room because at the end of a project, when you hear that final sound mix after you've gone and you've waged every battle, one of you lost a lot, but you're finally getting it done, and to hear a great sound mix, it all comes together. It feels real for the first time when you hear that sound.
Oh, it's always been a pleasure to work with you, and we did some really great projects. One of my favorites was the Sound of Music, and
which one? It seemed like every 5 years we did it again.
The five, not the 75th, but the one before that, because it was really interesting, and just you get to know it and how they post production and stuff. There's a lot of really good things in there. So yeah, we worked on a couple of really fun projects, and Stephen wrote this amazing book. It's music by Max Steiner, and I'm going to let him talk about it, and I've got some questions, but really quick, Stephen, tell us a little bit about the book.
Okay, well, I'll back up and say that I have worked mostly as a documentary producer in my life, and as you mentioned, I had the good fortune of working with you, Mike, for about a dozen years, mostly doing documentaries about Hollywood. My background was on things like the A&E biography series, producing profiles of filmmakers, but I've always had a love of classic Hollywood. I grew up here in Los Angeles. My brother was a Broadway performer when I was 8 or 9 years old. He's quite a bit older than I am, although has a lot more energy than I do. But I was lucky to kind of move in those circles a bit as a kid, or at least meet some of the people involved in old Hollywood. And for one of our family friends was a guy named Robert Osborne, who was then a columnist for the Hollywood Reporter, and of course then went on to host TCM, and Bob and I worked together there for many years. So I've always loved doing things with new movies and looking at the past. And when I was in college 100 years ago, when I realized I wasn't a good enough pianist to become a professional piano player, I decided to write a book about a composer, and that was Bernard Herrmann, the great film composer and great sound innovator. And he had died just a few years earlier, and so I still had access to an amazing number of people who worked with him, all of his family, all three of his wives. And that was a great, fun 8-year experience that I started in college and finished out of it. And flash forward, nearly 30 years, and a good friend of mine is a wonderful writer named Gary Giddens. He was maybe the featured talking head in, I'd say, probably the most prominent person in Ken Burns's jazz documentary series, because he's such a great writer about jazz. He's written many books, Louis Armstrong, he's Bing Crosby's biographer. Anyway, Gary and I became friends, and he said, how would you like to write a book for me? I'm overseeing a series for Oxford on American figures, and many of them are people that should have had a book by now and somehow didn't. And he started naming a lot of really interesting people. And then when he got to the name Max Steiner, I said, stop. Okay, if we're going to do this, I'm in. That's who I want to do. And I'm sure some of the people if are watching this saying, who is Max Steiner? Why should I care about Max Steiner? Well, Max Steiner has been called the guy who invented film music in the sound era. I would say he's the person who pulled all the elements together, much in the way that D.W. Griffith in the silent era took a lot of things like the close-up and other things and created kind of the grammar of movie storytelling, but wasn't necessarily the first, but was the first great artist to do so, politics aside. But Max Steiner was that guy who came from all these different worlds. He was born in Vienna to this incredible family. His father was decorated by the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so they were a big deal. Then he left Vienna, lived a colorful life in London, and then when World War I broke out, he suddenly was an Austrian in a country at war with Austria, so with no money, because he spent more money than he ever made, he jumped on a ship to America, worked his way up, became a Broadway conductor with Gershwin and all the top Broadway, the people who wrote what we now call the Great American Songbook. Max was the conductor / orchestrator, everything for those guys. And then in the fateful year of 1929, when all the Hollywood movie studios decided they would officially stop making silent films and everything was going to be sound, all these studios realized they needed not only actors who could speak, but musicians and music departments. So Broadway was a logical place to sort of pick people, and Max, being a top person on Broadway at the time, was asked by this new studio, this young studio of a couple of years, RKO, to come out and work for their music department. And while Max was at RKO in the early 30s, he convinced skeptical producers, studio executives who did not want to have any underscoring in a dramatic film or a comedy or anything to have underscoring in film. And I know that seems crazy at a time where everything from video games to commercials to movies and TV shows all have music under dialogue, and music's an important component. But sound was such a different medium in 1929, 30, 31 that even though people had only watched movies, silent movies with music playing the whole time, there was something about the realism of talkies, of hearing people speak and hearing natural sounds, that made these rather literal-minded new filmmakers say to Max over and over, but Max, won't the audience say, where is the music coming from? And this drove him crazy for about 2 years, because he did not think people would have a problem with it. And he got very lucky because just when RKO was about to go out of business after a string of flops, and remember, the Depression had just broken out, the Depression had just happened, and the movie studios were not doing well, and they just spent all this money converting to sound. RKO was really on the verge of closure when they hired this young 20-something executive named David O. Selznick to see what he could do. And Selznick just came in like a bat out of hell and put all of these great movies into production, one after another. I mean, in the space of 12 months, he made a lot of classic films. And most importantly, as soon as he arrived and he met his musical director, Max Steiner, they had a conversation that probably went something like this. Max said, I've been trying to get these guys to let me have music in the movies. And Selznick said, I love music in movies. You're right. Let's do it. What have we got to lose? And right from the get-go, the first films that for which Max was allowed to write a full score, and by that I mean he wrote themes for different characters the way John Williams say would. He used orchestration in a very particular way to create mood. He was really sensitive, having conducted all those years on Broadway, to the human voice and how to write beneath the pitch of an actor's voice or above the pitch. He actually would listen to an actor's voice and say that Betty Davis speaks in the key of F, so we're writing above and below that. So, and
that's
I should,
cool.
Yeah, it's so cool. And he was 41 when he came to Hollywood. He had lived this whole adventurous life, not really being very famous, but being, a working musician. And then talk about being in the right place at the right time. He's the guy in Hollywood when no one knows what to do and says, I've got this idea. And in that breakthrough year of 1932, he and Selznick, scored one great movie after another. And the culmination of that was the movie that Max started scoring at the end of that year, a little thing called King Kong. And King Kong is often, there we go. And you will often hear people say, well, that was the first movie that a symphonic score was written for. Not true. Max had been doing it for a year, but it's the first classic film we remember that has a great score. And there's no question that I would say Star Wars and King Kong are the two movies that convinced more would-be film composers to become film composers. And so what Max did in those years of 32, 33 changed the movie business. He's the one who led studios to hire their own staff composers, to create that infrastructure of orchestrators, sound recordists, engineers. And the other amazing thing, and RKO was, they hired the right people, but they were kind of lucky that they hired an amazing sound recordist engineer named Murray Spivak. And he was a musician. Yeah, Nick is nodding. He was like Steiner coming out of New York, and he was a percussionist, and he really understood music. And at first, they didn't know what to do with him, so they didn't even have a music department. And Murray Spivak said that for a little while, they put him in the place where they kept the cowboy star Tom Mix's horse, and in the barn where the horse used to be. And they gave him a microphone and said, "We'll get back to you." And Spivak, like all brilliant people, got bored, and he started hanging his mic out the window and recording Sunset and Gower. And he'd tell people if they were recording a sound film, "Hey, any sound you hear, record it. I'm building a library." So that's how RKO built their library. And then when King Kong came along, and again, this is 3 years after talkies have really started, they're making the equivalent of like a Marvel movie. They've got a big John Williams score being written. They have got, sounds that no one's ever heard for these dinosaurs. It's like Jurassic Park. Like, what does a dinosaur sound like? And for King Kong, Murray Spivak, and again, they had like 3 tracks of sound at this time. They're recording most sound live on set. Murray Spivak is recording animals backwards, playing them backwards and forwards, mixing these tracks. He's doing his own growls for Kong's more, specific sounds. He's mixing them together. He's like Ren Kleiss is now for David Fincher or someone. And he and Steiner were just like peanut butter and jelly, because when they would get to things like the famous climax of King Kong on the Empire State Building, Spivak would take the recording that they had of the planes attacking Kong, and in the sections where there's music and planes, which isn't very much because Max deliberately dipped out the music for most of that scene, but when there's some overlaps, Spivak would change the frequency of the planes so they did not conflict with Steiner's music.
Wow.
And think about how many composers now, understandandly say, "Oh my God, I wrote all this music and you can't hear it because of the sound effects, or they mixed this or that."
So that's so true. And today there's that constant battle between sound effects and music, And
there is.
And as a mixer, some of the new tools that we have, well, actually they're newish, like surfer EQs and things like that, where you can EQ based on tones as opposed to based on frequencies, really help clean that up. But the fact that they were doing it back then is phenomenal.
It's mind-blowing, and I'm so lucky that not only were Max's papers saved by a great archivist and a friend of mine named James Dark, but UCLA has most of the RKO papers, and so you could go to the daily production reports, and and the USC has the papers for Warner Brothers, where Max later was a staff composer and scored Casablanca, The Big Sleep, Mildred Pierce, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. I mean, I haven't mentioned that not only did he basically create the film score as we know it, he worked on about 300 films starting at the age of 41, and you've heard of half of them and you've seen a third of them. But back to that time at RKO, it was so exciting going through all their paperwork, and Max would write on his scores not just musical notes, he'd write the dialogue of what was happening, because he's using blank music papers, so he's writing, it was Beauty Killed the Beast, at the very end of the film, and he's writing what's happening, and he's using different color pencils for main theme and counter melody or different colors. He's trying to help his orchestrators who are taking his very detailed pencil scores, and he's writing down what instruments what he wants to use. He's taking he's handing those off to his orchestrators, who are creating parts that are put in front of the musicians hours later to score all night from like 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. so these movies can be mixed. And it was this factory system, but he thrived on that. And the amazing thing is that within that very short time, they created, a very, I mean, you listen to King Kong, and yes, it's a very early soundtrack, but the complexity of it is astonishing. And I tried when writing the book to see as many of these with live audiences as I could, to see if they held up or if people laughed at them. And there was a screening of Kong, appropriately at Grauman's Chinese, where it had opened in Los Angeles in 1933. And I deliberately stepped out a little early so I could hear people walking out. And people were saying, wow, the sound in that was amazing. How did they do that? And boy, that score was great. And they were loving it. And it made me feel so good. And we all, movies have gone through a time where you have more music. Like John Williams brought back the big sounding score for a while. Sure. Now we're in a time where you can have that, but it's mixed really low. A lot of filmmakers don't like a lot of distinctive themes unless it's animation. Thank you, Disney. Thank you, Pixar. But things wax and wane. But music has never left, and it really, I think, is movie dependent. And Max was fortunate because he understood that for an intimate drama, you would write a very different kind of score than you would for a King Kong or Gone with the Wind or a movie or a Betty Davis movie for Warner Brothers that is a big melodrama, and if you and Casablanca, I mean, that's a movie where you have very subtle cues, and then you have music that just rips your heart out. Sure. And it was made to be seen in a theater with other people, but most of them play really well on TV. So Max was really quite the innovator and pioneer in both sound and music.
Let me ask you, so as soon as I knew you were going to be on the podcast, the first thing I did was read a ton of the reviews of the book, which they're fantastic. Everybody loves the book. But the second thing I did is I actually, if you have HBO Max, King Kong, the original version, is on HBO Max.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so I turned it on and I watched it. And I was amazed once you get the perspective that this guy's inventing all this. Like, when you say the grammar of music, he has the emotional underscore during the love scenes, and he has the tension and all the things we take for granted. Yeah. And it's so powerful that at the beginning of the movie, where there's hardly any score, right? It's just talking and talking and talking. I don't know how many minutes they go with
I'll tell you in a second, but go ahead.
Well, it just feels so empty. Like, you're like, wow, it would seem like you're in a vacuum. That was the modern audience.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that was Max's choice. He writes this great overture, and it isn't just what they typically had, which is kind of generic melodrama music for a drama. Right. He gives you the themes for Kong, for Andero, for the island, the sacrificial dance, and then he gives you this kind of sad version of Kong's theme at the very end of it that tells you this is going to be a tragic story. Then when it's in Manhattan, the movie starts in Depression, 1933. This crazy filmmaker, Carl Denham's looking for his leading lady before dawn when their ship's going to leave with a bunch of bombs on it to go to an island no one's ever heard of. And Max said to the producer, Marion C. Cooper, let's not have any music in Manhattan. He said, there's plenty of sound. You've got cars honking. You've got a lot of dialogue back and forth. And he said, when we get to the island, let's bring in the music. And the first cue of the film is called A Boat in the Fog, and it's this beautiful kind of Debussy-like piece that as soon as you have a fade up and they're in the fog, you hear harps and you hear this kind of English horn that sounds like kind of an oboe playing very distantly, and it just very subtly takes you into another world. And then as they approach the island, the drums start, and Michael Giacchino, who's a big Steiner fan, does a wonderful homage to this cue, the Forgotten Island in Up. There's a similar cue, not at all a ripoff, but just and similar enough where he's nodding to Steiner, and you hear this subtle kind of rhythmic sound as they see Skull Island's Great Wall, and even in the dialogue they say, "Listen, there are drums," and there's this kind of deliberate confusion between what we would call source music, the music people are hearing in the movie, and the score. And Max is kind of subtly taking you into this world, and by the time you see Kong, it's like a big crescendo mark. If you play music, like it's the gradual acceleration of volume, so that when that big gate opens and Kong comes out, you're in this different place. And then the music is just on fire. And they were smart enough to stop it in key places, like the big T-Rex fight. That's Murray Spivak's show. That's all the sounds created by him for minutes. And then Fay Ray screaming her lungs out. And then the music comes back. So again, for something that was so new, I marvel at the smartness they had about pace, about
Absolutely.
The audience might be exhausted, so you give them a sound break. Now you bring the music back. And then the most complex sound design of early movies is Kong in Manhattan. That's when they pushed everything with multiple re-recorded tracks, screaming, car crashing, Kong, music. I mean, that was like you're trying to have Hubble's telescope vision when you're Galileo.
Right.
And they pulled it off.
It's truly an amazing movie when you watch it in context for the music, because when the music, after the silence, not silent, but there's lack of music, when it comes in, it's magical. I mean, it's just magical. And then the build and the whole thing. What I want to know is, and maybe you can answer this, is I look at the stop motion animation and what they had to do back then for sync, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they had the music, they had to sync the dialogue, and then they had to sync that against stop motion animation. That blows my mind. It's
stop
so
motion,
difficult.
Stop motion that had live action put into it, and apparently they would, for some of the times where you would see like Bruce Cabot underneath in a little cavern and Kong's above him, they would stretch a condom out and project the pre-shot material of Bruce Cabot frame by frame, as Willis O'Brien did the stop motion animation of Kong. So you've got a little movie screen made of a condom. Apparently, this is all true. I'm not making this up. And so you've got to sync his sound as well. So yes, interesting challenges on this film, but and they pulled it all off. I think it's stunning, and of course you've all been very patient listening to me talk through all this. I'd love to hear your thoughts about if any of you are interested in early film or what you pick up on in movies, how you think sound design has changed for better or worse.
Well, you know what? I'm gonna throw it really quick to Rob, because Rob is our resident composer, and he's composed for film trailers.
Monsters.
Like
He scored
Rob.
Monsters too.
When you got the gig for the King Kong trailer, there's a lot of emotional,
No, I did Godzilla.
I mean Godzilla. Yeah, sorry, I said.
But Godzilla has met King Kong.
Yeah,
It's true.
Yeah, you're right. But when you did Godzilla, right? What were the parameters that you were working on, and did they give you anything like for the emotion? Like, did they give you any type of tenet, like make sure you do this and have the tension build here and things like that, or were you just free to to do it on your own? And then did you have were you thinking about any of the classic movies and the classic scores that you heard when you were doing that? Because that's a pretty awesome.
I had
soundtrack,
been
right?
absorbing film scores since I was a little kid, and I have pretty much a photographic memory for music. So when I hear something, it sort of gets locked in, and I refer to it later. And so I grew up watching tons of movies and sort of memorizing the scores and use that as a palette to pull from. The producers for all the Godzilla stuff did not give specific direction. The main, they trusted my sensibilities. If they hadn't liked it, they would have said change it. But and these days, unlike back in the 30s, we would do synth sketches, and they would, you'd need final approval before you spend a dime to have a 100-piece symphony come in, because it's just so expensive. But the main issue that I ran into, it was with Godzilla first, but with a lot of movies, was just in the battle of music versus sound design, you should always assume you're going to lose as the composer. So on the first Godzilla trailer, and Godzilla was a good project because I did 3 separate theatrical trailers, which 2 of them were not in the movie. They were shot specifically for the marketing campaign. So we did 3 trailers and 87 separate TV spots that each had different music. And so I got to really experiment because it was a year and a half. It was like scoring several films worth of music.
Right.
But the main issue with Godzilla is anytime he would roar, forget it. Nothing else was going to be heard. Or in the first trailer, his footstep comes through the roof of the New York Museum of Natural History. And I stupidly wrote some music I thought people might hear as his foot hit the ground, and there was no chance. And Scott Gertchen, who's normally on our panel, was doing the sound design for these. So we were locked in a battle, kind of like Godzilla and King Kong were. But what I learned as a composer is my moments to shine were right until something was going to happen and right after something happened. So I would always be trying to build that anticipation so that when Godzilla finally screamed, I mean, I could have the whole orchestra put down their instruments because it doesn't matter. They could be playing as loud as they want. You're never going to hear them. So I was all about the transitions in and out of things that I knew were going to be sound design moments. And then we all got along great because they would play up the music because it was needed to sort of justify, you know, the big payoff in the sound design. So that was an early lesson I had to learn. I had learned it in theory before, but until you work on a project like that, where you actually then hear it on a giant stage being mixed, you realize, oh, this is a battle I'm not going to win unless I get smart about it. So I used to joke that, you know, all the most brilliant things about the first trailer I wrote right for when he steps through the roof, and so you never heard him. But
I do remember that spot for what it's worth. So I know that I'm sure the music had a lot to do with that.
And if you didn't notice the music, it means I did my job. The most famous one of those trailers was one where there's an old guy fishing on a pier.
Yeah.
He sees a wave in the distance, and then it gets closer and closer and closer, and the music builds and builds and builds, and then Godzilla appears and the whole dock explodes with it. And that got a ton of play. And it's funny because there are still movies ripping off the concept. I mean, different characters and stuff, but and every now and then I'll even hear that music that I wrote for that because it's in Sony's library, so I'll hear it relicensed for use in other trailers. But it was amazing because just in that moment, like, there's this huge anticipation as the guy's fishing, and then he sees a little something in the water, and then it's getting closer and closer and closer. So as a composer, that gave me plenty of time to shine. It just wasn't at the moment of peak action.
Right.
At that point, sound effects win. And I think, honestly, if there are going to be sound effects at all, I'd be fine with having zero sound effects, but if there are going to be sound effects at all, they need to win at that moment. I agree. I mean, I've also had to function as a producer, and objectively, the sound effects should win at that moment. It's just that as a composer, kind of kicks you in the butt.
I think, you know, sort of rule number one of composers working for film is never put a timpani hit on an explosion. Just don't do it.
No one will ever hear it.
Well, no one will ever hear it. It'll always lose. You don't try to get into the same frequency range as a sound effect when it's something in which you're matching picture like that.
And one thing I also used to do, because I love playing with pitch, and I have perfect pitch, and everything to me in life is pitch related. And I would often, like, if I had a character talking in a scene, I would often have an instrument playing a harmony to what they were saying as they were saying it. And it was always a very subtle thing, but if you had a really quiet, like, woodwind bed playing a harmony to what a lead character is saying, it felt like everything was merging together. And I used to love doing stuff like that. I miss all the parts of it that we're talking about now. I don't miss how incredibly complex politically those projects grew over the years, because there's so much money riding on it. And especially, like, at the time of Godzilla, it was the largest marketing campaign in film history. And the main mark that it set it is the trailer. The first trailer I did was actually the loudest trailer in movie history, and forced the entire industry to rethink all their levels, because the trailer was so loud that all the theater owners turned down their sound system. And then Independence Day, which was the movie it was attached to, played soft. 97, 98. So,
wow. So you're responsible for that.
Yeah, but then, then standards came out for how loud a trailer could be, and everything got out. But the politics and the complexity, because there's so much money on the line, I try to always think as like a purist composer, just about the creativity, but you never really could get 100% into the creative space because it's such a business.
You know, speaking of politics, back in Max's time, there was tons of politics going on with the whole music, right, Stephen? Because I read like the serious orchestras didn't really respect the whole movie biz. And
there were a lot of different battles going on. Some are different from the ones today. Some are similar. And one thing that is great about today is there's so much less snobbery, so much less prejudice against people who write for film. You know, composers now, I think much more are seen as composers. Whereas as soon as you worked on a movie, it didn't matter if Bernard Herrmann had written a symphony or did other things. He was a quote unquote film composer, and he loved movies. And it wasn't that he felt insulted being considered a composer who wrote for film, but what Bernard Herrmann and Max both agreed that they were very different in many ways. But Herrmann was particularly articulate in saying, there's essentially it's that Louis Armstrong line about two kinds of music. You know, there's good and bad, but Herman liked to say Mozart wrote music for dinner parties, and Haydn ate in the kitchen after playing for the, it's like, let's not get too precious about these people. They were working musicians writing for their time. And he said, any composer who has a dramatic instinct is missing a great opportunity if they don't work for film, or in his lifetime, radio and television, because he did them all. He wrote music for The Twilight Zone. He was Orson Welles' music director for Welles' great live series that included the War of the Worlds broadcast that made him famous. So Herman was really eclectic. And Max worked in many different kind of live music forms, but when he got to Hollywood, it was the right fit. And for all of his complaining and quitting if he'd been working without sleep for weeks, he knew it was where he belonged. And he scored movies until he was 76 years old, I think.
That's phenomenal.
And he would have kept going, but he lost so much of his eyesight. And of course, by 1964, 65, the world had moved on.
Right.
But I will say, just a last thought on the politics of music, that when Max started writing for film, being one of the very first composers to write real scores for sound films, he joined ASCAP thinking, great, I'll get royalties for this music also. And they said, "Oh, we don't handle that music. We're not interested in that kind of music. We handle sheet music. We handle records," which in those days were 78 RPM popular song hits. And Max waged a battle from 1933 to 1960, amassing the forces of all the composers who became composers in Hollywood through first a group called the Screen Composers Association, and then it became more famous groups. But he was the one who started that battle and was kind of a figurehead throughout to get residuals for composers. And so every composer who gets a royalty now, I think, has Max to thank for part of that. And that's another story that had not been told. And I felt so lucky, I felt gifted that Max not only worked on these great films, and he was a colorful, larger-than-life guy with flaws, but really relatable ones. He was married many times because he kept falling in love. He was a gambling addict. He was a music addict. He was a life addict, everything in major portions.
That's awesome.
But he also really cared about people. He was loved. And I think the fact that he fought for composers and musicians and said, this isn't fair, and won that battle is just a great part of his story.
You know what's amazing about Max, and kind of as I was preparing for the podcast, he goes in, and basically back then there was no aftermarket for movie scores. I mean, it was just
or movies they played, and that was it.
Yeah, and so he did all this work for like one-offs, and I was just amazed that the complexity and the talent that he went into some of those movies, knowing that they weren't going to let's face it, people will see it, but it's not like if you were a composer and people heard your music all over the world and things like that. I mean, obviously the movies were popular, but they're not, they weren't nearly, what we have now.
No.
And he did it like for one-off. And that to me is like, wow, that was incredible.
It is. And I mean, we all, of course, have grown up seeing older movies on TV and, home video and all those things. It's important to let people know or remind them that when 98% of movies were made by Hollywood, they were considered over when they had done their run around the world. I mean, if it was Wizard of Oz or Gone with the Wind, it would get re-released 10 years later. But the rest of the movies, nothing. I mean, maybe an art house in New York for the biggest 2 or 3 for a couple of nights. But
Right.
those movies were gone. So the fact that a Max Steiner and Bernard Herrmann would write great scores, that the screenwriters, directors, and filmmakers would all do their best work, which they so often did, is amazing. It is also kind of heartbreaking. There was a letter Max wrote in the 30s when he was fighting the ASCAP battle, and I'm paraphrasing a little, but he said, "It's a hell of a thing to know that a man has written as much music as I have in my lifetime, and it is all dead," because as far as he was concerned, none of that music would ever be heard again.
Oh.
And that's why when later, if they would use a theme for a character in a 1953 movie that they used in the 1936 movie, years later when those movies were all on television, people would go up to the person you really didn't want to say that to was Bernard Herrmann, who could explode over nothing, or a Max, and say, "Hey, you used that? Wasn't that theme from the Three Musketeers? Didn't you use that later in Jim Thorpe American?" And it wasn't that they were just ripping themselves off. It was that in the case of Max, he had as little as a week sometimes when he was a Warner Brothers composer to score a 2-hour movie. Wow. So of course if it was appropriate, he was going to use and rewrite a theme that he'd used for a forgotten flop movie 15 years earlier. The amazing thing is he didn't do it more, that they all didn't do it more often, because it's amazing to me that Steiner could have worked from the 30s through the 60s and had such a bountiful gift for dramatic instinct, for melody, because he was one of the melodists. Bernard Herrmann didn't write tunes. He wrote the shower music from Psycho. He wrote, and he was a brilliant composer, but he just proved that every composer didn't have to have a great melody in him. Well, Steiner was a great dramatist who had plenty of great melodies in him, and it was a fountain that ran pretty strongly for 35 years and 300 movies.
That's incredible. Rob, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was astounded to learn not that long ago that a lot of those movies from back then too, like, not only did the studios think these things were like one and done, they would destroy all the prints. Like there are a lot of movies from back then that they didn't even hold on to one print of.
No, it's true. If for example, and that's especially true of the silent era, is that, when they switched to talkies, there was active destruction of films by some studios because they just didn't want to take up the space for those movies. But one thing that did happen is if say a major book or a popular book was optioned by the studio, they would try to get things just like now in perpetuity. But if the writer would say, well, I'll give you those rights for 10 years, well, 10 years later, a lawyer at the studio would say, oh, by the way, the rights are running out. Do we want to renew that, or do you just want to junk that movie? And sometimes the studio would say, just get rid of the movie. That star isn't even at the studio anymore. We had him under contract, but he's not popular now. Get rid of that movie. So it really is amazing that things that were expensive, that were big, that were seen around the world could be thrown out. And that's thankfully less true of the sound era, but it also is true of movies from the sound era. And we're lucky, we're fortunate that so many of them survived in good prints. And I will say that Max, this is another forward thing. In those days, in those early film days, music was recorded optically, just like on film, because that's the way you had it clean. We all know that old records had hiss and pop and clicks. But if they wanted to check and see how the take was on the spot, they would do these acetate recordings where they just use a cheap, system to create an instant record and play it back and think and listen and say, okay, you didn't hear that oboe squeak, we're okay, we can move on. Well, Max was the only composer of that period who kept the majority of those sessions. He kept those records for himself. And being a smart guy, sometimes he'd make them and with the studios, okay, give them to friends or other filmmakers and say, oh, here's a cue I wrote for this. But he kept them for his own archive. So I got to hear him stop a cue or hear things go wrong or all of that. And I could hear the music clean. That's so cool. It's a fascinating experience, but it also just showed that much like Herrmann, he had a sense that this was of some importance. And he wasn't pretentious about it, but he wasn't undervaluing what he did either. And both of those guys, Herrmann and Steiner, both during their careers, would show scenes. They gave a few lectures. I would give anything to have been at either of their lectures.
Wow.
They would show a scene without music, and you'd hear the creaking, set, and there'd be the awkward pauses and the cuts between close-ups that were, often intentionally left a little wide for music. And then the scene would be played with the score. And I've read so many newspaper reports or thank you letters of people saying it was excruciating or it felt endless watching it the first time. And I couldn't believe how quickly it moved and how involved I was. And it was the same scene. That's
amazing. That's phenomenal. Let me, we're getting close to having to wrap this up. This is so amazing. I could listen to hours of this
I didn't
stuff.
mean to take up so much of your time tonight. Apologies, guys.
It's great. But one question I had for you after I've did a bunch of research and stuff. Was there anything that surprised you? Well, I guess everything surprised you, but was there anything that really surprised you that you found out about Max?
Yeah, I did. He's always been known as the studio guy, the guy who scored 1 million movies. I didn't know if he farmed out the work a lot of the time. He didn't. I was really astonished to see how conscientious he was. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with, hiring other people to do things when you need to. He did. If the schedule was too short, and on Gone with the Wind, when David O. Selznick was full on crazy by the time he had Max working on that movie. And not only was Max scoring a 4-hour movie with about 3.5 hours of music, but Selznick was making him rescore every scene multiple times.
Wow.
So when the deadline, when they had that major Atlanta premiere that everybody in the world knew about, and they had to hit that date, Max had to give the themes out for the second half of the movie to a lot of the orchestrator composers, who were people like future Oscar winner Hugo Friedhofer, and they would work under his direction. But even then, he tried to do as much as possible, and it was really just because time ran out. I was amazed that anyone could live 83 years and get so little sleep. What didn't surprise me, it did break my heart, and it is the cautionary lesson of Max's life, and one that we all know working in the business that we do is, if you put all of your energy and all of your emotion and all of your heart into your work, and you have people in your life around you, somebody's going to lose. And I don't want to say what happened in Max's life, but I will say, right? And I don't mean that as a criticism of anyone. It's just that we all have limited, finite hours on the earth. And I think that if anything, Max was he was so empathetic to characters in film and people in real life, and he was so energized by he had strong drives in life. Every drive you could mention drove him, but composing was one of them. And I think he really just was so, for all the complaining he'd do about it, understandably, the hours they made him do and how much they made him do, he loved it, and the people in his life suffered because of that. So his life was really like a Warner Brothers melodrama or biopic, in that you have this incredible success, the greatest success, a triumph. We haven't even talked about the fact that that at age 71, this Austrian symphonic composer wrote what Billboard magazine says is the biggest selling instrumental of the rock and roll era in the theme from A Summer Place, 1959, which is so weird and an accidental thing. Saved him financially after years of debt, but he had such success, and although his life had great happiness and joy, it had great tragedy, and it's that mixture, that bittersweet quality of it, and it didn't destroy him, and he lived after the tragedies, but it reminded me that we all have to step back, even when we really love something, and make sure that the people who are around us are getting the attention they need.
Balance.
Particularly now.
Particularly now.
During this
the word is balance.
Yeah.
Well, Stephen, I can't thank you enough for coming on and talking about your book. And once again, this is your book
He looks
cover.
very stern there. He's having a bad day at the Hollywood Bowl. Frank Sinatra has shown up late for the rehearsal, and it's not going to go well that day. Spoiler alert. There he is, feeling very confident, having signed a big contract with Selznick International in 1936. He's going to go gambling that night, I think, and lose everything he made. Here he is conducting Gone with the Wind. He was not a tall man, but a big presence.
So good.
And he was also a goof. Oh, here he is with Fred Astaire and Mark Sandrich, who directed Top Hat and a lot of the best of the Astaire Rogers films. Max was the musical director of the Astaire Rogers movies, was a very important part of those. And there's Casablanca, which he loved doing. He would fall in love with his leading ladies like many composers would. I mean, from a distance, and really write from the heart for them. And he could write for Rick Blaine. Max's wife had left him at the time he scored it, so I think he really related to that cynical, funny, bitter, romantic character that Bogart played. And there's Kong. And and he was a goofball, and he had a silly side. And here he is with Freddie Fleck, an assistant director at RKO, and he just was, for a very serious composer, he could be a really fun-loving guy. So that's why I like that picture.
That's a great picture.
It's a reminder to have fun while you're working, right?
That's right. This is supposed to be fun. Let me tell you, once you start, I just started, listening to King Kong, and you listen to some of these other movies that he's been, you really realize that he really did, invent the grammar of film scoring.
Yeah.
But
instinctively, with no time, yes.
But B, you also notice that, if you go into some of the modern movies that we have, sometimes it just gets a little crowded. There's a time where you can just, the overscore. There's this overscore sometimes. I wish more directors would let scenes breathe a little bit.
quite often when we are noticing like a big score, it's because the composer has been told, and this happened to Max and Herman and is happening today somewhere. This movie we had a disastrous preview. You've got to score this scene and save us. Every composer has heard the phrase "save us," and that happens a lot. And just in terms of talking about then and now, I will close by saying that when they were temp tracking Star Wars and they wanted to convey what the movie felt like, they used some of Holst's The Planets, a symphonic piece, and they used some Eric Wolfgang Korngold, the great composer of scores like Adventures of Robin Hood, and they used Max Steiner. So there's some Max Steiner DNA in Star Wars. So it just, it all ties together.
That is the best way to end this whole segment. Max DNA in Star Wars. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for coming on and talking about Max and talking about your book.
Thank you. I'll sign off so you guys can talk about all these other things that.
Actually, you can just stay there because we're going to be wrapping it up. But do you guys have any comments or questions, really quick, for Stephen before we?
Or your own thoughts or your own experiences?
I was kind of hypnotized listening. It was great.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's very cool to learn. Yeah.
The thing that I was really ruminating about was this notion of, films being this sort of one and done thing, and the idea of, true art music versus film music. And while I love these composers, don't get me wrong, I'm not wailing on them in any way because they're some of my favorites. It's like, I wonder how many people in the world have heard Pierre Boulez or Karlheinz Stockhausen or John Cage versus the people that have heard Bernard Herrmann and Max Steiner and things like that.
Well,
right?
It does come down to taste, and I will tell you, I prefer the latter composers as pure music, and I with no disrespect to Stockhausen and Boulez, but when Bernard Herrmann was asked by Francois Truffaut to score Fahrenheit 451 in 1966-67, Herrmann said to him, "You're friends with Boulez, you're friends with Stockhausen. Why aren't you asking them to score this movie?" And Truffaut said, "They will give me the music of the 20th century. You will give me the music of the 21st."
Love it.
And at first I thought, and of course that's that's a great quote. And then I thought, futuristic music. And then I thought, no, we're in the 21st century, and Truffaut was right, because that is the coin of the realm. That's the music that everyone knows in the world, not just because it's played all the time, but because Bernard Herrmann wrote a brilliant score for movie after movie, and Max Steiner wrote brilliant scores, and we can name 100 women and men who've written great scores. So, and that takes nothing away from the composers that you named. It's just a different medium. And I would say, and again, just one last time, Herrmann had the great point that not every great composer is a great dramatic composer. Right. And not every great dramatic, but Max Steiner didn't write a symphony because he knew that wasn't what he did best. He was inspired by seeing someone else's, emotional situation and writing music to it. It's a little like, I think Stephen Sondheim once said, "I can't write a love song, but if you tell me you want a song about somebody who's been waiting in a hotel in New York and someone hasn't shown up at 3:00 because," in other words, scenario, then you've got drama, and he can write a song. Right. And I think it's a different kind of just creative impulse. And fortunately, we live in a world where we can hear Boulez's conducting and composing and all those things in a click. I mean, I do wish Max could know that you can click your smartphone and download King Kong. King Kong played beautifully in a modern recording by my friend William T. Stromberg with the 100-piece orchestra that Max wanted, and not the 46 musicians RKO would pay for. So Max hired musicians who could play multiple instruments and put that one instrument down and pick up the other one so you could make it sound like the 100 people,
Wow.
Anyway.
That, what, that's the magic of film and the magic of scores for films is that you just never know when you're going to get these little gems. You never know. Obviously Max invented the grammar, but then there's been some one-offs where composers have come in. Done an
amazing people now coming from different disciplines, in education, experiences.
One of my all-time favorite music soundtracks is "To Live and Die in L.A." And that was done by Wang Chung at the time, right? So Wang Chung comes out, and they're doing all their pop music, and then they get asked to do this score. And the funny story about that, and I'm working on a project where I interviewed Jack Hughes. The director told him, I want you to write the theme song, but whatever you do, don't put the phrase "to live and die in L.A." and so Jack said, that was the first thing we did. So, but it's just scores.
Right.
These all film scores are awesome. Whether it's Wendy Carlos and Susie Ciani, or Tron. I mean, there's just so many.
So much,
scores.
and you're so right about break the rules, because Alfred Hitchcock, when he showed Bernard Herrmann's Psycho, and Hitchcock was not happy with the movie, and he thought it was slow, and he wanted to shorten it, and Herrmann said, "Don't shorten it yet," and Hitchcock said, "Do what you want. I trust you. The only thing is, do not write any music for the shower scene." So what did Herrmann do? And he did it in a way, exactly. And he didn't do it in a way of like, well, you're wrong. They recorded the session, and in a rare moment of diplomacy, Bernard Herrmann said, Hitch, I did write music for that scene. Obviously, you don't have to use it, but can I just play it for you? And we know what happened after that. Hitchcock, for once, admitted, you're right, I'm wrong. That's going in.
That's fantastic. Let me just tell you, this conversation was probably the smartest thing we've ever talked about. Between you, Nick, and you, Stephen, when you were talking about those composers, my IQ just went up like 10 points. So I just
I was going to say, that's how I feel watching your podcast. So I felt like an imposter being here. Thank you for letting me feel like I belong.
No, you're not, like, your knowledge has been great. Let me just tell you, I got to tell these guys, like when I used to work with Stephen, we would have talks about old time radio shows, because I had
quietly, so that they didn't think, get rid of that guy.
I had a massive drive, 2 hours every day to and from, and so I got into old time radio because I was just amazed at the sound and the sound effects and all that stuff that was going on live. Like when they can, Sergeant Preston of the Yukon, and they're doing these ships that get stuck in ice, and they're doing this all live as they're doing these radio shows. It was amazing. So anyhow, we had some great conversations. So Stephen it was just amazing, and I'm so glad your book came out and the success it's had, and just congratulations. I am phenomenal.
Literally honored to be with all of you and such an incredible group of talents here tonight. Thanks for letting me join you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, well, before we go, really quick, anybody working on anything they can talk about? Brandon, you working on anything fun and exciting?
I actually am just launching into a new sound effects collection. It's going to be a fight sequence sound effects. So I'm doing a bunch of, recordings right now, and just downloading different fight scenes from movies that I'm going to design to. And then, so yeah, just putting that together. So I'll be in that world for about 2 months.
Nice. Well, great. Just in time so that I can go, hey, Brandon, do you have a good hit? How about you, Nick? You working on anything fun and exciting?
Well, I'm working on something very fun. So as we're recording this, today's December 10th, I think?
Yes.
So 2 weeks from Christmas. And we decided 2 days ago that people are sad enough, and so I put back together again the choir that we used to sing with at Disney, which of course has been shut down for 8 months or so. And on a bet, we decided that we were going to start recording some Christmas carols, which we will do. Everyone will shoot themselves onto their iPhone on Saturday, send me all the stuff, and then on Monday and Tuesday I'll edit them together, turn them into videos, and try to get them so that Disney can post them for all of the cast members that work around Disney to put a little smile on people's faces before everything shuts down for the holidays. So that was just a sweet thing.
That's great.
It was, Carol of the Bells is one of the songs we're doing, and I always thought it was the cheesiest sort of tune, yan da da dum bum ba da dum bum ba da dum bum ba da. Well, if you listen to the overall orchestration, I mean, when you actually see the way that the different soprano, alto, tenor, and bass come together, it's a gorgeous jigsaw puzzle. It's just that, that one little sort of melodic element. But once you step back a little, it's like, wow, this piece of music is really great. So,
that's amazing. That's great. How about you, Rob? You working on anything you can talk about? I know you had that big presentation, right? 10,000 people.
Yeah, I was part of the jazz conference, and that was really fun.
What?
I was worried about people peppering me with questions that were like too out of left field, but it was fine. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, and I think that's still available online. The Jazz Masters Summit, people can go and join up, and they had a ton of really amazing interviews. I was much more a spectator than a participant. It was really cool, but my segment went well. And now I'm working with a new artist on some career guidance, a little bit of music, but more some career guidance. And some of it is things I'll be able to talk about in the new year a lot more, a lot of exciting things going on. And I would also say, one of the things I wanted to say when we were still talking about composers, one of the composers who gets overlooked a lot, and I'm a huge fan, was Carl Stalling from Warner Brothers cartoons and stuff.
Genius.
I used to listen to his scores just for entertainment because he was the closest I ever thought a composer got to where you could not have the visual and the story would be told exactly the same.
Yeah.
His stuff was so nuanced and so detailed.
Yeah.
Every single bit of the action without having to see the action.
Yeah.
I mean, he got a lot of respect, but I think a lot of people undervalue, oh, it's just cartoons. I don't think they realize
now that you can sell out the Hollywood Bowl, though, I'm so glad all those concerts like Bugs Bunny in concert have shown how great that music is. And, how did most people hear their first Wagner? Kill the Wabbit, right?
Exactly. If you haven't been to one of those shows where they sync the live music with the screen, you should, because it's incredible.
That's great. Well, that's awesome. That is really, really cool.
What are you up to there, Mike?
Well, I'm up to a couple things. First, right off the bat, working on the Mega Spaces AudioNowcast around the world. I was supposed to release it in December, but I pushed it to January because I just got too many things going on. And then we're going to be changing some stuff on the podcast, the Nowcast Network, and we're going to produce some more content for it. We're going to start a little Patreon thing just to kind of help, offset some of the costs for the new content that we're going to do, because we're going to do some new content. And it was all inspired by all this stuff that I was doing with Bliss and was doing around the world and things like that. So I did AudioNowcast around the world, 60 minutes, but it's probably going to be like 85. Because we went to a lot of studios and I'm chopping and I'm like, I can't chop anymore. So that's why it's taking so long. So it's kind of fun. So other than that, just trying to be lean and clean and, get rid of some gear. So there you go. How's that for bringing it all the way back?
Anything new with you, Steve? What are you working on? Anything you want to?
Oh, thank you. No, it's so strange. I thought I'd spend this year going to bookstores and libraries promoting a book. Instead, I'm doing like webinars like every week and podcasts talking to people in Australia, and I'm doing a London talk on Steiner soon. And I kind of love that part of it. I mean, believe me, I can't wait till we're back to whatever the next version of the normal world is. But I hope we can keep this aspect where, I mean, I wouldn't have been here talking with you tonight probably if this hadn't happened. So I would love to see this aspect of what's come out of it, continue. So that's what my world is like yours, a virtual one dealing with microphones, but getting to talk about something I love and with interesting people.
Stephen, have you shot curious, have you shot an audiobook version of your book?
No, I haven't, but actually it's funny, when I wrote the Herman book, a group in New York was making a documentary about Herman, and they brought me on as consultant, and that got an Oscar nomination and did well. Weirdly, for a composer, Max Steiner, who will have passed on 50 years next year, he died in 1971. Weirdly, as I was writing this book, an editor filmmaker named Diana Friedberg started making a Max Steiner documentary. So I'm in it, and I think it's just now down to the film clearances and music clearances, because they're easy, right? I mean, let's music clearance, movie clearance, no problem there. So once we have movie theaters open again, hopefully there will be a story of Max Steiner film to accompany my book. But thank you for asking, Nick. I will happily come over and read the book to anyone who wants it, but I don't think they want to have me around for that long. Plus, the cat has to come with me. So
that's great. Hey, one thing that I wanted to ask you is, let us know when you're doing one of those webinars, because that would be great. I would really like to know when you do one of those. As
Max often thought, be careful what you wish for. So I will do that, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great. I've seen, since we're Facebook friends, I've seen a couple things go by, but
it's fun when you can, share some of the music. And there have been so many good re-recordings recently of the music out there. Yeah. So anyway, thanks. This has been a lot of fun.
All right. Well, hey, if you have any comments or questions, you can reach us at audio@nowcastnetwork.com. That's audio@nowcastnetwork.com. I want to tell everybody that, you can find all our podcasts on audionowcast.com. for those who just watched the video. And we're going to be switching. We have the podcast on IGTV, Instagram TV, but I'm going to be switching it to YouTube because Instagram TV still has the hour cutoff. And some of the really good podcasts go 62 minutes, 63 minutes. This one we're 70 minutes, and it's all gold. So I'll do a cut down version on IGTV, but you can watch us on YouTube and leave a comment and question there. All right, gang. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Stephen, thank you once again. And
My
for
pleasure.
myself and everybody, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
We're waiting for our Christmas cookies, Joanne.
Thanks for listening to the Audio Nowcast, sponsored by API and Wire World Pro Audio. The Audio Nowcast is hosted by Mike Rodriguez and features a panel with Rob Arbertier, Bobby Osinski, Scott Gershon, Nick Peck, Diego Stucco, Brandon Birdside, Martin Page, Bobby Summerfield, and maybe a guest or two. We'll see you next time.